It's not too late to get a good deal on some new windows. Winter is coming. Window Nation is offering 50% off all window styles, so now is the perfect time to replace your old windows with new, custom-built, high-quality ones. Choose from over 1,500 styles and colors that all help protect and beautify your home. So don't miss out, because this is Window Nation's most popular deal. Schedule a fast, free consultation with Window Nation today. Call 866-90-NATION or head to windownation.com. Today on CityCast Chicago. Back in September 2021, Chicago dispatched its first ever care team. The Crisis Assistance Response and Engagement Units were teams of mental health professionals, paramedics, and police officers that responded to mental health crises. 4 years later, and we want to know how it's been going. It's Thursday, September 4th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago is talking about. Policing the Vulnerable is an investigative series from Mindsight News, Medill Investigative Lab Chicago, The Invisible Institute, and Southside Weekly. I'm joined today by Mindsight News Chicago Bureau Chief Josh McGee. Josh, welcome to CityCast Chicago.
Thanks for having me.
We've also got freelance investigative journalist Maggie Doherty in the building. Maggie, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Josh, under pressure from advocates and clinicians, the federal government, Chicago organizers, city council, and more, City Hall considered programs that would take more mental health related calls out of the hands of police back in 2021. That kind of what was promised with the care teams when Mayor Lightfoot announced the 2-year pilot program. Mayor Johnson came into office and promised to double down and expand resources for the initiative. 4 years in, how is it going? How is Chicago dealing with mental health related calls?
I mean, I think the important thing is that the care team is here and still exists. On the other hand, we're talking about what is a pilot program that has been rolled out over some years, and with different administrations, they've had some different problems and different issues. When Mayor Johnson came in, his big deal was taking the police out of it, which was what people were originally fighting for. And last September, he was able to do that. He took fire and police out of the system, and that had some bumps in the roads. Removing them meant that basically they weren't going to be able to take as many calls, or they were going to be fighting with kind of the police to get to the scene and kind of help out. So there's been a big kind of change in the amount of calls during the last year that they were able to receive, and I believe that number's kind of ticking up now again.
Yeah. So as it stands, who is on a care team currently?
I'm a mental health clinician and an EMT.
What have been some of those major sticking points throughout both the pilot program and the expansion of the care teams over the last few years?
I think we see that a lot of it comes down to funding. The project this year had a lot of funding that's disappearing because the ARPA funds, which were in place, are going to be leaving. And then, like Josh said, it was kind of a win, to many people that police were taken off of the care response, but that's also really affected the way that these teams are dispatched. And so now we see that dispatchers are more reluctant to dispatch the care teams when a mental health call comes up because they're worried about some other medical issue involved in the call or some criminal activity that could lead to violence. And so they don't want to dispatch the care team in case, there's some liability there. And so instead now we see that care is not getting as many calls dispatched to them, and instead it's going to police or traditional paramedic fire rescue.
You mentioned ARPA, the American Rescue Plan, which, most people have referenced as the COVID relief aid that came into the city of Chicago. And much of the funding that has anchored the care team has been that. In fact, $6.87 million was used to budget for care since 2022, while the city has allocated about $1 million a year to the program. As fewer callers are being routed to the care team, that means Chicago police are taking the bulk of these calls. Do we know how many of these calls are coming in, whether it's daily or annually?
The number rests between 100 and 200, somewhere close to over 150 calls per day are mental health related that police are responding to.
We know that at least in the past year, in 2024, the Chicago police responded with force to 400 calls, so more than one a day, where Chicago police responded to a mental health incident and used force in that response. It can be anything from using handcuffs to restrain someone to lethal force, shooting and killing someone, or any other form of lethal force. And I think that part of the issue that we've seen with traditional police response is a failure to de-escalate. We talked to Craig Futterman, who's a sort of expert on these issues and has been in the Chicago discourse about this for a long time. And one thing that he said to us is that Chicago police tend to yell and, demand orders, tell people, drop the knife, just come at them with a higher level of energy instead of working to de-escalate the situation in a way that people in mental health crisis need. Because if you're experiencing some mental health distress or, are in a place of substance use, you're not maybe going to respond in the way that they expect you to and want you to. And then that just ramps up the energy of the whole situation and leads to this use of force, which then harms people who are already in such a vulnerable state.
Josh, can you also kind of shine some light on how is that different than what was supposed to be happening with the care teams?
Yeah, from the care team, I think the number one thing is they don't want someone to use force. They don't want it to be a violent interaction, and that's where care comes in. They don't come in with a gun or a taser or anything on them. They're unarmed. They're trying to de-escalate the situation, the same thing you kind of want from the police if they're going to respond, but they're just actually trained to kind of recognize it and recognize these situations better. I think from reading the whole package again and again, you just see so many different kind of incidents that are mental health related that you do wonder, okay, we see that police are answering a lot of these calls, but what would it be like if care was able to do that? And I think that's kind of a little bit what's missing, is that we don't get to see what happens when care, though we do get a lot of documentation of what happens when police are responding.
Can we get into some examples? Like, I know throughout the reporting, you all talked with families who've experienced, in many ways, both sides of this response. Can you talk about what it was like for people who made the call through 911 or directly to the care team, and what that appropriate response looked like, or what that care response looked like?
Yeah, so in Rachel's reporting, she talked to the mother, Pamela, whose daughter was having some serious mental distress, and she had called care to come in and help. And she said that it was really valuable for them because in the past, interactions with police had been very traumatizing. To come in and have police in your home and feel like your mental health issue is something that's criminal. Having a team come in that can just listen and sort of talk you down and get you the care you need voluntarily makes a big difference from what people have said. And I think that they're afraid that if this program goes away, that resource, which has been so valuable to them, is not going to be available.
And I think my reporting, or our reporting with Invisible Institute, highlights the forced hospitalization, which we say, and the experts tell us, has become this kind of default approach for police when they're deciding that someone might be in mental health crisis. And I think when we re-listen to the story of Jeanette Baz, there is concerns about, the situation she's in, how she's living, but she doesn't believe she's in crisis. She believes that the police are escalating the crisis.
Why were police even at her apartment to begin with? This didn't even start, I don't think, with a call for a mental health related incident.
No, this is basically a call for her to amend a report. And the story she tells us that she basically had some issues with her apartment building and she wanted something fixed. It was either a water line or something, and she wanted them to come in and fix it. They didn't tell her a time or the appropriate time. They knocked and they came in, and she was in a state of undress and she wanted them to get out. She was trying to go to a doctor's appointment, and basically she says that they were filming her. And basically the police come and they say, well, we've already taken down a report of this. What are we supposed to do here? And basically she's saying, and it's in kind of the dispatcher notes, that the sergeant said, come here if you want to amend the report. We need to do a new thing because the first time they said it was non-criminal, and this time she's saying that there's some criminal activity. And I think that's where everything kind of spins out of control. It doesn't seem like the officer really wants to just write up a new report or solve it this way. And that's when it kind of takes this sharp turn. And, I kind of note the amount of time we see on the body cameras footage because it's 8 minutes. It's not that long when we're talking or communicating with anyone to decide, okay, this person's going to be hospitalized. And we don't really think about how long this hospitalization is going to be, what's going to be the long-term effects of this. And that decision is just kind of made so quickly. There's a part where she wants him to get out, and she's asking him over and over to leave kind of her apartment building, and he refuses to leave. He follows her around. She says she felt like a trapped rat in her own apartment. There's a police officer who's heavily armed who's not allowing her to move around freely. He's kind of following her around, and that's when she runs away from the officer. She's running through her own apartment building. She's tackled, and it's just this kind of violent interaction. To start, if she was in crisis, this wouldn't be the way you would want to approach this or start the hospitalization. She's taken out of her apartment building on a gurney.
I mean, are these hospitalizations tracked? Is there oversight on the hospital side?
So that's been really the difficult thing for us to kind of track down, and not just in Illinois. We've tried in multiple states and multiple kind of things, and the data is all kind of kept in different forms or different formats, and especially when we're talking about hospital data, there all becomes like HIPAA problems and all of these things. So the data we were able to look at was CPD data, police data on how many times they're filling out the form and checking out the box that they said this person needs to be hospitalized. And when we were looking at it, and we have in total data going back to 2017, you realize that this isn't something that they were doing comprehensively. Every district wasn't doing this, only certain officers were doing it. So the data isn't kept well. It's getting better. That's why we kind of focus on the last couple years. But that also, we're noting that over this time, this hasn't been used well. So it does become a little bit of an unreliable data set. But it does give us at least a baseline of how often police are using this.
I mean, you all in your reporting around involuntary hospitalization and commitments, I mean, really do such a vivid job of like painting like the fear that people feel in that moment. Can you kind of describe what makes it different from a traditional arrest? Like, how are officers able to, do they have to do to justify hospitalizing someone versus arresting them versus like leaving them alone?
You're supposed to be able to acknowledge that this person is either a harm to themselves or a harm to others, or they're not able to take care of themselves. One of the blank fields in the data that we have, they basically redacted all of these things that would say if this person was they thought this person was in psychosis, or they thought this person was suicidal. And I think that's where we kind of talk about why they're supposed to be a mental health professional, because you can note like, okay, well, this is what someone who's suicidal acts like or says. These are the code words. I think that people who have been hospitalized, even from a mental health standpoint, have not always trusted the clinician actually was making the best call, but we know that that's a better call than kind of this quick decision that's being made by a police officer.
If you're looking for a new career, I want you to pause for a second. What exactly are you looking for? Maybe it's something that's flexible, that works on your time, something where you can use those people skills, your creativity to work with and connect others. Something where you can make an impact. If the answer is yes, then maybe you should consider real estate. Realtors not only help people buy and sell homes, but navigate Chicago's rental market. They help people find the next great location to realize the small business dreams, which means you can help people find stability, put down roots, grow something in their neighborhoods. Plus, you get to set your own schedule, choose who you work with, explore different parts of the city. So if real estate is for you, here's how to get started. Visit realtorsrealestateschool.com today to schedule your free career consultation. That's realtorsrealestateschool.com. Maggie, the whole point of removing police from care teams was acknowledging the reality that police are not mental health providers and that their presence can escalate these situations. In addition to creating the care program, there was also supposed to be more de-escalation training in CPD. Does it seem like any of that has been implemented or taken up?
They've tried to implement the critical intervention team training. I'll say that that's slightly less in my area of expertise on this project, but my impression is that even when they're doing the CIT training, which is supposed to help officers understand how to de-escalate situations. What we've seen is that they think that they're better equipped. Like if you poll them on their feelings on their own ability to de-escalate a situation, they think that they're better equipped, but then when you look at the data, CIT trained officers still are involved in use of force incidents and still continue to use force in mental health situations rather than de-escalating. When the whole force is not, I guess, trained in these things, there's going to be officers who are dispatched to calls that have a mental health element, even if they weren't flagged as such, that then respond. Like in the case of Timothy Glaze, it was a mental health incident. It wasn't flagged as that on the 911 end. It was an urgent situation involving mental health, and you could maybe tell if you carefully listen to the 911 call that there was alcohol involved and that somebody might be in an altered state. But the officers who responded and shot Timothy Glaze didn't have CIT training. I don't think they even necessarily went in understanding that it was going to be a mental health call. So it's like you need officers, if they're responding to calls, to comprehend that people's mental health might be involved in any situation you're going into. I mean, mental health is such a spectrum, and people can be suffering from different things when you're going in. So I think that even the efforts that they've made to try to do that just fall short in what we're seeing.
And I think the Latoria Hill is kind of a good highlight or illustration of this. The lead officer who's taking control of the situation is CIT trained, and you see her kind of talking Latoria down, trying to de-escalate the situation, but she's surrounded by 8 other officers. These are men with tasers pointed at them.
Can you describe the situation, the story, what was happening here?
So Latoria Hill is, she's a 36-year-old Black woman on the west side of Chicago. She's outside of her home. Police are getting multiple calls of this woman. Some say she's got a broomstick and she's attacking cars. Other people say she might be armed with a knife. Another caller just notes that it's noted as a mental health disturbance. So the police come out. There's a woman officer. She's de-escalating the situation. She's saying, hey, we need you to put down the knife. We need you to put down the object. Hey, I can give you a cigarette. Do you want to smoke? Trying to just kind of get her into a different state of mind, trying to change this scenario. But in the background, in the meantime, there's 8 officers flanking her, kind of moving closer, inching closer with their tasers pointed. She has her taser out too. But at some point, you can see Latoria basically trying to explain, I'm looking for my phone. She's kind of rummaging through either trash or clothes that are outside of this door of what looks like a storefront or an apartment building on the west side. And basically, as they keep approaching, she gets a little agitated and she runs into the door and runs into the apartment building. And basically, as that happens, that's when the police get agitated and start moving in. They get to the door, they kick it down, and then she's basically walking slowly backwards up the stairs with something in her hand. They're telling her she needs to drop it. Obviously, this is redacted in part of the video, so you can't see exactly what she has, but they allege that it's a knife, and she's just refusing to drop it. She's walking slowly up the stairs. Eventually, they tell the other officers not to tase anyone because she's walking up the stairs, and they think she'll fall and hurt herself. She gets to an apartment, and she basically tries to open the door and go inside. That's when they fire the taser. They hit her, and then they come in, they tase her again. They all tackle her and basically put her into a gurney and have her taken away. The apparent fatality that happens after this. So it is kind of a situation where one officer is CIT trained, and you see them trying to do this and trying to de-escalate the situation and have a better ending. But the amount of other officers who are kind of attacking the situation in a different way, a more violent way, it just makes it impossible for the situation to de-escalate. If one officer is trying to talk and the other officers are yelling for you to put down something and pointing a taser at you, it doesn't really make you feel like you're about to be helped. It makes you feel like you're about to be tagged.
I mean, with so many calls flagging this as, potentially like a crisis of someone's mental health, is there any sense of why there were no care professionals? It sounds like this was in a part of the city that was in their jurisdiction.
This happened in May 2020, so the care team isn't really out yet, so it's not really an option.
I mean, so why are fewer care calls happening then?
It's a reluctance. We started with having the police and fire on these teams, and that kind of interconnected the dispatchers. From doing this reporting on criminal justice and mental health for the last 3 years, I've had the opportunity to speak to dispatchers on the record and off the record. And, one of their things is they're connected to the police. They want to make sure police officers come home safe. So that's why they'll dispatch, or they'll be more cautious of a call if someone has a knife or anything like that. But now the care team, because they're not connected to the police, they are dispatching themselves. They're listening for calls where they could be helpful instead of the 911 operators themselves dispatching them like they were able to do in the earlier years of the program. So that's really kind of limited the response, though we're seeing that care is getting better at seeing what calls they can go to and dispatching themselves, though police are often on the scene before they get there.
The fact that care was moved into public health, does that mean that dispatchers aren't allowed to even route calls their way? Or is that like a turf war situation where like police are saying, well, since they're under public health, they're sort of cut out of the like kind of dispatch hierarchy?
They're still allowed to, and that's why we're seeing, I think the number's down to like 8% are being dispatched from the police, but they haven't been doing it as often. Maggie, is that correct?
I think it's a little higher. I think that in 2024, 32% was from OEMC, the dispatch central, and then another 30-some% was referrals from police officers or CPD request, and 30% was the self-dispatch where they're listening to the radio and say, that sounds like a mental health call, and just go out to respond to it themselves and often get there after police. In 2025, it's gone down, I think, where now this year, almost 3/4 of all calls have been self-dispatch, where they're just listening to the radio. So there has clearly been a drop, both in the number of calls going to them and the ones that they are getting routed directly from the call center.
As you all wrote these stories, the bureaucratic and funding challenges for care moving forward are very concerning, right? As the funding from the federal government dries up, Mayor Johnson has promised to find that somewhere, but with a $1.1 billion budget gap right now, do you all have any sense from the mayor's office or City Hall what their plan is for the CARES team in this next budget season?
Mayor Johnson did say that he planned to have the funding for it. That was his promise to us. But, there is that question of where does that money actually come from and how is it going to pan out? I think, there's major questions as we think about the Trump administration and what they're going to be willing to fund and not fund and help out with. We know that Chicago is some kind of target for all of these things. This is one of the solutions that has been offered, and it seems important to keep some of these solutions in tow. Otherwise, we will just have police answering these calls.
What is the reputation of the CARE program in this larger public safety apparatus? Are they, seen as like a real partner in the like larger Chicago strategy to help, individuals dealing with mental health crisis?
I would say that maybe initially, my impression is that when CARE was created, it was kind of a compromise, right? Because a lot of people were pushing for, a defund the police or total separation of police. And then we got this pilot that involved both police and non-police response. And that was supposed to be sort of a bringing in together under Mayor Lori Lightfoot. And I think that while police were on it and while fire was on it, there's some sense of maybe buy-in from those organizations. But then you remove them and suddenly it's like, okay, well, you do you, is my impression. And Josh might be able to speak to that better. But, the fire department has been quite upset that the EMTs on CARE are not part of their union. And so there are these tensions, and I think some level of turf war that does not lend itself to partnership and collaboration.
In lieu of growing the CARE program, as I read through your reporting, it sounds like we are still in status quo territory where police are overwhelmingly responding to calls. Use of force is still being used. These involuntary hospitalizations, as you've called them, Josh, have become like the default method. I guess my question is Chicago in a worse place than it was 4 years ago, as this system has seemingly become more entrenched and the proposed solution has become, I guess, degraded of resources over the past few years?
I think there's no way to say that we're in a worse position because we do have these options. I think even Pamela's story, like it's a small story, it's one person, but it's somebody who knows that if someone's in crisis, they have this option, the care team. Like that's an option they have. That's an option they can tell the police. That's an option they can tell the 911 dispatchers, and it can help clarify the situation. One of the problems that the CPD was having before was they weren't able to recognize calls as mental health related. So, that's one of the big deals was we know now that these calls are mental health related. That doesn't necessarily mean they're not going to use force, but it does mean that they can think of a better way or a solution and try to present that. I think that it does get a little bit scary when something like this can be taken away. But I think one of the bigger deals is with some of these mental health services that we're becoming more accustomed to, such as 988, like the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline that's gone nationwide. These give us more options. They don't necessarily prevent the worst things from happening, but there's so much stigma around mental health and mental health crises that, this person, Pamela, can talk to another mom or another person and say, hey, this is the option I use, and they can do word of mouth. They can kind of help each other and they help the self in the community, where if we're not talking about it, if we're not talking about how often police are using force, if we're not talking about the existence of the care team, then we really don't have that option. That stigma just continues. And, we're not thinking about the data on shadow arrest or involuntary commitments. And we're highlighting that these don't necessarily have the best results. And, part of it is we do have to study this. We have to study the pilot program. We have to see why pilot programs don't work or do work. And all of that has happened now. As a journalist who's been doing this for more than a decade in Chicago, pilot programs always kind of scare me because they're limited funds. But they do tell us, hey, this could happen. There could be a little bit of success. Here it is. Here's how it happens. So it does give us something for someone to fight for, some kind of solution that we think can work.
It's definitely scary, I think, to think that somebody might look at this and say, okay, well, we tried it and it doesn't work, and just give up and say that's a solution that we're going to shelf. But this is part of a sort of national movement. There's programs like this all over in small towns across the US that are trying this, and some are having struggles similar to Chicago. I mean, it's a big city. It's hard to do a huge logistical project like this successfully, especially on the first go. And so there's lessons learned here and elsewhere, and I think it's important that the care team, and the administrators of it stay in this conversation with other programs across the US to figure out what are the elements that really work and what are the elements that, are maybe causing these roadblocks. But I don't think that, like Josh said, it's a regression. I don't think we're worse off than we were before this program started, because we're moving towards something rather than just saying, well, we're just going to stick with the status quo.
My last thing that I don't think we've gotten to is, the series is called Policing the Vulnerable. And as we speak, the president is trying to send in the military to essentially sweep people off the streets. This broader political context, you have a sense of the type of pressure this is going to put on the city of Chicago.
Yeah, I think we're going to be in the national spotlight. We've been forced, for the last week into the national spotlight, being called all kinds of different names. And I think this is something they're going to highlight. They're going to highlight, look at how many people we can put away quickly or move off the street. And, I do think that's kind of scary. But I think what's most important to know is that there's racial discrepancies. Most of this is happening to Black men and Black women. We need to talk about how often this is happening in our community. And if we don't have numbers and we don't see the stats, we're not going to even think about it. We're just going to be just another thing that can be kind of hidden. So I think with like this huge sweep, we should talk about what it looks like for the military to be here and try to move people off the streets or throwing everyone into these scenarios, which in the long run hurt people. It makes people more likely to die by suicide. It makes people more likely to die of a drug overdose. It's another way to kind of hide problems. So yeah, it's going to be very scary, and it's going to be very scary for very specific communities. And we know this. We know that the forced hospitalizations are happening downtown. We know that they're happening in kind of the public square. So Millennium Park, the places we see the unhoused, the places we've kind of gotten used to seeing them too.
And just to add, specifically in our data, we saw in the last 5 years that even though Black Chicagoans only make up, less than a third of the population here, more than 2/3 of these use of force incidents against people in mental health crisis are directed at people who are Black in Chicago. So there's clearly a disproportionate, direction of that force when people are struggling the most, and having agents on the street who, may or may not have any identification and are just kind of sweeping people off of the street. There's a lack of accountability and impunity that I think pairs very well with the way that police officers can get away with these use of force now. I mean, I think that ICE being and the military being on the streets in Chicago just adds another layer of this sort of lack of accountability. And it's hard to focus on all of these different things when there's so many abuses happening. It's a distraction from these things that we're already trying to track down on or fix. And I don't think that this is going to help any of these issues we're seeing.
I appreciate that you all are shining a light on something that otherwise, as your reporting lays out, would be thrown into the shadows. I want to give another huge thank you to our guest today from Mindsight News, the Chicago Bureau Chief, Josh McGee. Josh, thank you for making time today.
Thanks for having me.
And freelance investigative journalist Maggie Doherty, thank you.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Before we get out of here, some good news. Chicago's German American Oktoberfest is going down all weekend long in Lincoln Square. That's just one of many Oktoberfests happening in the city. And so, go ahead and look them up. Plus, you also got the Von Steuben German Day Parade. That's like a 15-minute walk away from that Oktoberfest celebration up in North Center. That's going down on Saturday. The Cubs got a home game that afternoon against the Nationals. So maybe you're trying to live your Ferris Bueller's Day Off type day. Head over to Art Institute. All you gotta do is find a fast car and you ain't even gotta skip school. So, hey, make it happen. We're gonna be back bright and early tomorrow. Hopefully you'll join us. Peace.